about why I chose this topic. I've taught kind of the idea of Kedusha in a few different contexts, and I feel like every time I teach it, I have some sort of new framework to look at it. And, it started out in kind of the obvious, like Parsha, Kedoshim, Tihiyu, what is holiness? What does it mean to be separate? And then really, I think I started to reframe Kedusha for myself when I started to teach Kala classes, and talk about what does it mean to bring this kind of, like, is it holiness? Is it separateness into relationships? And then a few years ago, I was teaching at a high school in Los Angeles, and I was working with one of my closest friends on building this kind of like ethical, progressive, but from and halachic sex ed curriculum for our high schoolers. And we decided to use the topic of Kedusha to frame the whole 4-year long curriculum. And one of the things that I went into planning that class was that when you talk about Kedusha, when you talk about holiness or even separateness in the framework of relationships, like, you get a lot of people who roll their eyes at that because what does it mean to bring holiness into our relationships? And so I totally got that. So we were looking for a way to kind of reframe it so people didn't roll their eyes at the idea of Kedusha. So then, we jumped in there, and then we kind of worked our way backwards. So I want to work through some of that with you. What is Kedusha? What is holiness? What is separateness? And really, like, what does it mean for our lives? Because I think we could look at holiness as this kind of aspirational but abstract thing that we don't know how to put into action. But I don't really believe the Torah puts things out there that we aren't supposed to use. So we're going to explore that. As always, if anyone has like an idea or a thought, I welcome it. And I can't see everyone, so Rabbi Lofsky, can people unmute if they want, or just I can unmute?
I think I've set it that people can unmute selectively.
Okay, great. So if anyone has like a thought or a comment, feel free to unmute and stop me where I am, and we'll talk through it. I'm going to stop and ask you guys at certain points what you think about things. So even if you weren't planning on it, get ready for it. Okay, so we're gonna start from the beginning. Sefer Vayikra Daber El Kol Adat Bnei Yisrael ve'amart alehem Kedoshim Tihiyu Ki Kadosh Ani Adonai Elohechem. Speak to the whole nation of Israel and say to them, you should be holy because I, your God, am also holy. So this is kind of the framework in which Kedusha starts. It's a way in which we're supposed to take after God, and what follows this is a whole list of laws through which we're supposed to make ourselves, separate. As the Sifra you see right underneath, the Sifra says Kedoshim Tihiyu, Prushim Tihiyu, that you should be separate from other people. So the laws that we practice daily are laws that are both supposed to elevate us through holiness, but also laws that are supposed to separate us from those around us and from different moments in our day to kind of make them special. Rashi adds to this separateness, and Rashi says that the idea of Kedoshim Tihiyu, of being separate, it doesn't just mean like live your lives separately, but Rashi explains that this separateness is specifically from the arayot, from the forbidden sexual acts that the other nations were doing. And it's explicitly said later when the arayot, when the forbidden sexual relationships are spelled out, that we are supposed to refrain from doing these because we're supposed to be different from the other nations who do them. So this idea of like separateness around sexual immorality, it's not one that just comes up here. It's one that kind of keeps resurfacing. And Rashi continues to say that it's clear that wherever you see Kedoshim Tihiyu, wherever you find the commandment to do any sort of offense or any sort of separation, you also find the mention of Kedushah. So he's just kind of elaborating that this idea of Kedushah is one that keeps us away from others. His example is that it's in sexual immorality, but as you see beneath, the Ibn Ezra has a different example. He says that this is actually a prohibition against idolatry. I don't think the two are a million miles apart. There's obviously some overlap with sexual immorality and idolatry. There's obviously differences as well, but I think there is some overlap there. And so Ibn Ezra says that the reason we're meant to be kadosh, or to be separate or holy, is because God is holy, and that corresponds to Anochi Hashem Elokeichem, the first one of the 10 commandments, and it links us kind of directly to that, and also to every other mitzvah that's going to come. So for Ibn Ezra here, the separation is about connecting to God. We separate ourselves from other things in order to be close to God. For Rashi, there isn't really a mention of separating ourselves in order to be close to something else. It's more separating yourself in order to fence yourself off of something bad. So you're not really running towards something, you're running from something. That's the difference between the two of them. Okay, before I move on, do one of those resonate more with anyone? Rashi or Ibn Ezra are running away from something, blocking things out, versus running towards something, kind of pursuing God in that holiness. Anyone who wants to comment, if you want, feel free to unmute. Okay. Okay. So Rashbam has a different take on it, and he says, "Kedoshim tihiu mipnei sheharbe mitzvot huzharu litkadesh ve'lishmor." That most commandments, or a lot of commandments, are actually. Did I skip one? Sorry, I think I have my notes different. One moment. No, sorry, it's just a note that I missed. Okay. So it seems obvious that living separate from other groups who have like bad behavior or different beliefs or beliefs that are inappropriate, it seems obvious that we would separate from people like that. So the example that Rashi gives, I think, is, obvious to us. Of course, we're going to separate ourselves from people who have beliefs that we think are immoral. But Ibn Ezra has his take is different, in that we're not running away from something only, we're running towards something as well. So we're not running away from idolatry, but in running away from idolatry, we are pursuing closeness to God. So Rambam, like the Chizkuni, sees that this commandment is like a summation of not just the upcoming laws that are going to be discussed after the commandment of Kedoshim Tihiyu, but a summation, or maybe like a catchphrase or a mission statement that encompasses Kedushah and kind of how it relates to all the mitzvot. So Rashbam says that most commandments in some way or another are designed to sanctify us and to be observed by us. And I would add, not just to sanctify. He's translating here, the translation of Lehitz Kadesh is to sanctify, but also to designate or distance. All the mitzvot we do in some way or another, they're meant to sanctify us through designation, whether it's davening and sanctifying time through differentiating it from the rest of your day, or saying a bracha, which is taking a moment and sanctifying the food through making a moment of gratitude or a moment of permission, however you kind of take bracha. But this mission statement of Kedoshim Tihiyu is not just applicable to the upcoming laws that are going to be listed. It's not just applicable to the idolatry, and it's not just applicable to the sexual immorality, but according to Rashbam, it's like an active mission statement by which we live our lives. And it also summarizes for him kind of the reason we do mitzvot. It's in order to separate either us from other nations, which we see again explicitly many times throughout the Torah. We're commanded to do things to be different than other nations, But I think on a like more kind of mundane day-to-day level, the smaller mitzvot, they separate moments of time from these whole or like mundane moments of time into moments of gratitude or holiness or whatever it is we're setting it aside for. Okay, I found this source and I really loved it. I actually found it when I was putting together sources for this year. I had never come across it before. Rabbi Shimon Shkop, who wrote he wrote this book called The Gates of Righteousness, or Shari Yashar. He studied at the Mir for 2 years, and then he went to the Luzhin and studied with the Netziv. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Telshi, amongst other really prestigious yeshivot. And so this is the first time I came across this statement, and I really loved it and wanted to share it. So he says, it appears in my limited understanding that this mitzvah includes the entire foundation and root of the purpose of our lives. Our work and effort should constantly be sanctified to benefiting the community. We should not use any act, movement, or get benefit or enjoyment that doesn't have in it some element of helping another. And as understood, all holiness is being set apart for an honorable purpose. That's like I would highlight, exclamation point, bold, setting something apart for an honorable purpose, distinguishing it. So now we've kind of evolved in our definition of Kedushah from holiness to separateness, but now separateness for a purpose, which we're going to call distinction or distinguishing. In relation to this, the holiness is comparable to the holiness of the Creator in whatever small resemblance. Just as the act of the Holy One in all of creation and in each and every moment that he continues to cause the universe to exist, his actions are sanctified to the good of others, so too his will is that our actions be constantly sanctified for the good of the community and not personal benefit. So I love this idea. First of all, the reframing of Kedushah as designation, to me, it kind of solves like all the eye rolls that people might have around the word Kedushah as holiness. Designating something in order to be special or for a certain purpose is something that we're constantly doing in our daily lives, whether it's our religious lives or, designating like a certain blazer as like a, good luck blazer to go to court or whatever it is. We're constantly designating certain things. We designate seats, we designate many things. So I love the idea of like it's serving a higher purpose. But really what kind of changes things for me in terms of Kedushah here is the way he talks about how it relates to us in terms of God. So we're not supposed to be holy because God is holy, and we're not supposed to be separate because God is separate. We're supposed to designate or distinguish because God designates and distinguishes, which I think is a really, it's an important nuance, because when we think about what it means to kind of live in God's image, we very often will talk about things like being a moral person, seeing Tselem Elohim in everyone. But if we look actually back at Bereshit and the story of creation, we see that God wants us not just to act like God in terms of, the morals, but just like God filled up the earth, God wants people to fill up the earth. Just like God named certain things, God wants people to name certain things. And this to me is like a very, very powerful way to think of Kedushah. Just like God separates things for purposes of, being holy or separating time to be special, whatever it is, just like God is constantly separating and designating, this mission statement of Kedoshim Tihiyu is actually an active mission statement that we are supposed to spend our lives designating certain things in order for us to reflect God. So I think that's an incredibly powerful idea. To me, it kind of it reframes like all of the eye roll that you can get when you tell people to live holy lives. Like that means different things for different people, but the idea that you take time out of your life to designate certain things, I think it resonates obviously as a Jew who designates time to daven, who designates moments before we eat, who designates a full day for Shabbos. But I think kind of across the board of people who practice intentionality, it's something that connects all of us to be able to stop for a moment and separate things that work for us or that we want to include and don't. I don't think that this means that the initial Rashi and Ibn Ezra were wrong. And I think, we could say if we look at Rashi, what it means to distinguish or to separate or to differentiate what we do in our lives, the way we do that is sometimes through a positive, but it very often could be through a negative. It could be through looking at something that we view as immoral and saying, I want to differentiate myself from that. I want to separate myself from something that I don't view as within the framework of my values, whether they're my values as a Jew or my values as a person. But sometimes we look in a positive way to bring something in, and sometimes we look in a negative way to keep things out. And so I think Rabbi Shimon Shkop, I think what he's saying is all inclusive to those who are saying you're running towards something or you're running away from it. Whichever camp you fall into, the idea that it's just something you do, you designate, you spend every day designating, whether consciously or unconsciously, we're constantly making choices of what we want in our lives, what we want out of our lives. So to do that with a level of intentionality is something that we do in order to be like God. Before I move on, does anyone have any reflections or thoughts?
Yeah, can I just ask?
Yeah.
It just sounds to me as if you've expanded the concept farther. Trying to bring those two concepts together is too much of a stretch. The notion of separation is quite different from the notion of dedication. And
so that's what he's doing. He's saying that it's right here. I'm just going to highlight it. Something that's set apart for an honorable purpose. So I think it's the distinction between separating for a purpose and separating not for a purpose.
But that's separating for a purpose is dedicating something to do something with it, like you're dedicating the food to elevate the food when you make a bracha. But when you decide not to eat something, that's quite a different activity, and you're not sanctifying it. It may be that there's a different concept of sanctity, which means that you're sanctifying yourself by not doing that thing. But that does feels like a genuine tension.
Yeah, for sure. And I think depending on what camp you fall into, how you view kind of holiness and distinguishing things, you either live a life where you feel that tension or you live a life where you don't feel that tension. But I think there are certain people who are very comfortable saying, my differentiation is by keeping things out, and like I feel holy and separate through keeping other things out, and that's my way of feeling close to God. And then there are other people who say, I choose to bring things in, and I choose to actively do a mitzvah, I choose to actively do good deeds, and that's my way of designating whatever it is, whether it's my time or my learning, my thoughts, whatever it is. But I think that I completely agree that it's a tension, not just within the text, but it's a tension, I think, in how people live their lives in terms of holiness.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we can all think of examples where people do things that we don't necessarily morally agree with in the name of holiness. Say certain things, do certain actions, and to me that is that tension. Is holiness being used as a way to fence things out and kind of keep yourself apart from it, or is holiness or separation being used in order to kind of keep your eyes forward and move towards God and move towards this more intentional kind of thoughtful life, which includes mitzvot, it includes time things, it includes Chagim, Shabbos, stuff like that. But it's certainly there. Like people live that tension. You can see that.
It feels like a difference between trying to sanctify yourself by separating yourself off and trying to sanctify the world by dedicating it. I don't know if that's the same distinction. But...
Yeah, no, I think people really do live that tension. Like I feel like we can all think of examples of people who try to sanctify themselves from being isolated from the world and from living their designated holy life separate from the world, not just in our religion. I think the idea of, monasteries and, like monks living separately, there's an idea that in order to achieve a level of holiness, you have to keep things away from you. And that's the only way to kind of get close to God or whatever higher power in your religion you're trying to get close to by doing that. But then there's also the idea that you designate things, you set them apart in order for kind of like a greater good. And we're going to see that greater good, according to Heschel in our next source, that greater good is holiness and closeness to God.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, let's read some Heschel. So Heschel says that to the philosophers, the idea of good was the most exalted idea, the ultimate idea. To Judaism, the idea of good is penultimate. It cannot exist without the holy. The good is the base and the holy is the summit. Men cannot be good unless he strives to be holy. So this is where I think like some of these bigger questions can come out of like, what is holiness? What is separateness? Is being separate good? I'm sure we can think of examples where being separate is good. We can think of examples where being separate is bad. Coming from America, the idea that something is separate, but don't worry, it's equal is something that was like ingrained in me growing up, is just not a thing. Something can't be separate and be equal. So that definitely is kind of like playing in my head as I'm reading this. What does it mean for us to be holy? Does it mean that we think we're better than, or can we just be different to other people? But certainly the idea that we're trying to be holy, and holy equals good. I think it could lead to very powerful and moral lives, but it can also lead to some problematics. Okay, I also wanted to bring in just a separate kind of more modern rabbi who he explains, I just have it on my notes, sorry, I'm looking down. So he explains that the mitzvah of Kedushah Tihiyu was given to the whole entire community, and we're gonna talk about this more in a minute. But he says it was given to the whole community. It wasn't just given to like Levim or Kohanim, but it was given to everyone. So achieving the state of holiness is not something that's done by just one group of people or a few special people, but it's something that everyone is supposed to do, which in a way shows us that this, even though we're talking about being separate, this isn't an act or a pursuit of elitism or, being super selective. It's just, it's an act of pursuing something intentional and greater in our lives. So I think the obvious question is, does being separated or separating ourselves from other people, is that something that's bad? And according to, for sure, to Heschel and to, I think also to Rabbi Shimon Shkop, I think the answer is that it's not. Even though I'm sure people can interpret the fact that we choose to live our lives largely physically separately because we tend to live in kind of small contained communities, but also with this constant weighing and questioning of what do we want in our lives and what do we not want in our lives based on what we're seeing around us. The act of designation is something that we should all be doing all the time, all day. We should be deciding whether or not we want something in our lives. We should be separating the things we don't want in our lives out of our lives. And I think whether we want to admit it or not, we all do it unintentionally. We all will walk by. I was teaching a teenager today, and we were talking about people making smart decisions and people not making smart decisions. And I was telling her that I was recently walking by the doctor, and I saw a doctor outside smoking a cigarette, and I thought, this is so interesting. Like, this is one of those examples where I would look at that and say, that's not something I want to do. I know the science on that. I don't want that in my life, and I want to keep that out. And you'd think that the people who dedicate their lives to science, that's something that would be obvious to them, but to me, that's just an example of like a way that we look at things and say, I don't want that in my life, like a very black and white example, that doesn't, maybe it incriminates the doctor, but to me, that's like a very clear example of being able to look at something and say, like, not for me. I don't like that, not something I'm choosing to include in my intentional life that's supposed to, bring me closer to God. So, okay. I didn't bring this in just because for the sake of time, I know we ran over the last few weeks. So I wanted to be sensitive to that. In Parshat Korach, Yeshayahu Leibowitz has a really beautiful insight. And he explains the problem with Korach's complaint. He says, Ki kol ha'am kedoshim, that the whole, why Moshe are you saying that you should be the leader? Aren't all of us holy? So he explains that holiness isn't just something that we are, like you aren't holy just because you're in this Edah, because you're part of this group. Holiness is something that you strive for. It's something that you actively pursue. He draws our attention to this juxtaposition, and he says, like, pretty simply, that there's two theories of holiness. Holiness can be understood as the outcome of people choosing to serve God. It's our dedication, it's our devotion, our commitments, that all of this does create holiness. And this is a theory of holiness that we see in the Shema, that this commitment really brings us closer to God. Korach's theory, though, is that holiness is something inherent in the Jewish people. God and God's people are inherently holy. So according to Korach, it's not the product of what one does, but it's the product of who one is. And so the question is, like, what makes us separate? What makes us different? What makes us unique? According to Moshe and Moshe's response to holiness, this is what Leibowitz explains. He says that according to Moshe, it's kind of like the Torah is our operating system. It's what we do. And according to Korach, we have a fundamentally different hardware to other people. And we don't necessarily need all of these laws to become holy. It's just part of who we are. So is holiness like an adjective or is it an aspiration? I think, Leibowitz is right that it's something that it is an aspiration. It's something we strive for. It doesn't say, Kedoshim Atem. It doesn't say you are holy. It says Kedoshim Tihiyu. It's something that you need to be this way. You need to constantly pursue it. And so I think it's very clear by now that I really absolutely love this reframing of Kedushah as something that's an active mission that we have to basically be spending our whole lives pursuing. And so I this idea of like Kedushah as being separate, as being distinct, in putting together this curriculum in Los Angeles, I decided that I wanted to kind of approach Kedushah and this idea of separateness from a completely different way. And I'm going to bring that in here now. And it's going to sound like it's from left field, but I promise you it makes a lot of sense. And it might even be interesting. I want to talk about Kedushah in the framework of Muktzah. Sounds like what Kedushah, Muktzah, how do those two things have, fit together? But just go with me on this, and if by the end you're not into it, I'd love to hear why and love to hear about it. Okay, so in Sefer Bereshit, we see that God separates the heaven from the earth. God separates the upper waters from the lower waters. We see that God is constantly separating, and then when it comes to Shabbos, we have finally the word Vayikadesh. It's separated and it's designated for a different purpose. That purpose is rest, but also the separation is from the time of the week where we do work. We have this Kiddush and Havdalah become kind of the framework in which God creates the universe, and also how we, obviously the words Kiddush and Havdalah are very resonant of Shabbos because we bring in Shabbos with Kiddush and we end with Havdalah. But it's also the methods through which God creates the world and separates all of the different elements of the world. And this idea that there can be separation without the thing being separated being bad, just because there's the heavens and the earth, God separates different things. We don't say that because one is separate, the other one is like a judgment on, because I live on earth, I'm judging the heavens, or because someone's in the heavens, they're judging the earth. It's just a differentiation one from the other. And that is where muktzah comes in. Again, stick with me on this. I promise you, it's kind of interesting. Okay, so in the Shulchan Aruch, we have a lot about muktzah, and I'm just going to bring a ton of it and kind of paraphrase it because we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of what muktzah is. But there are certain objects that are forbidden to move on Shabbos because they don't have a purpose on Shabbos. So the example I put on here is a knife that's used for shchita, for example. Well, a knife isn't itself obviously prohibited to use on Shabbos. Someone who is a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, is not allowed to touch or use that knife on Shabbos because we don't slaughter things on Shabbos. So also like a chef who has a set of knives, their set of knives is also muktzah on Shabbos because it has no use on Shabbos. And this is, I think when we use the word muktzah, like we don't always, obviously many people don't always use it in the right framework, but what it means is this is not the time and the place for that object because time is designated for something else, and this object doesn't fit into the thing that I've carved this time out for. And so the idea that, I think muktzah kind of makes this, bringing something in while keeping something out, I think it takes a lot of the, I don't want to say judgment, but it does take a lot of like the judgment away from the Ibn Ezra Rashi debate where we're talking about if we're keeping something out, it's because it's morally right or morally wrong. When we're talking about muktzah, the reason we keep something in or decide to leave it out isn't always because of morality. It's because when we designate a time or when we create a space, in order to keep that space what we need it to be, we have to make certain decisions to kind of keep the heart of the space. So for example, like on Shabbos, I can't watch TV on Shabbos. My remote control that turns on my television is muktzah because it has no use on Shabbos. It's not muktzah because there's batteries in it. It's muktzah because it's an object that has no use on Shabbos. Would I say that because the time and place for it isn't now, that it's a useless object or that there's something wrong with it? Absolutely not. And I think even more so in the context of like a slaughtherer's knife, to say that we don't use that knife on Shabbos, or like another example, this is a very American example, but this is the example I remember giving when I was studying Hilchot Shabbos, that my aunt has a certain set of salt and pepper shakers we only use on Thanksgiving. They're shaped like turkeys. They're like really intense, very American. We only use them on Thanksgiving. Let's say that it's like a random Shabbos and I needed a salt or pepper shaker. Am I allowed to use that salt and pepper shaker? And the answer is no. They're muktzah. They have use one time a year, and that one time a year is not on Shabbos. So the idea, and obviously there's nothing wrong with them. They're perfectly functioning during the week. They even enhance the mood once a year. They're like, they're the big show. But on that one day, in order to create the mood for Shabbos, I have to.
What happens when Thanksgiving falls on Shabbos?
Thanksgiving is always on a Thursday. Excellent question. Thanksgiving is always on a Thursday, which is why it's the Chag that my aunt hosts, because, we can drive there. But yes, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with mukta objects. And I think, especially having spent many years teaching teens and kind of discussing morality, I think the younger and younger the students I work with, the harder time they have with the idea of something being distinguished or separate, but being, equal or being separate without judgment. And the putting it within the framework of mukta, I think, takes all that away. There are certain things that are perfectly acceptable, but for the moment I'm creating right now, there's just no place. So designation, it leads to a kind of intimacy between, not just between us and God, but between us and whatever moment it is we're trying to create. Designation, it brings us close to God, because it's not just that this lifestyle, makes us strive for holiness by being like God, and the things we do are, hopefully intentional. And so every moment we take to distinguish something is done with the right mentality in order to try to help us lead moral lives and lives where we strive to help others and be like God. But I think maybe, to me, most importantly, Kedushah and the idea of designation, but designation that brings us ultimately closer to something, whether it's God or a higher purpose or morality or whatever it is. It's important because it's what God does, and we're supposed to be like God. And the Mishnah Torah teaches that, just like God visits the sick, so too we visit the sick. And just like God buries the dead, we bury the dead. And so just like God is mavdil and makdish, God is constantly separating and designating things. So too, we must also be designators and separators. And I think the framework, but with all of these different ideas, the way we separate things and the way we are close to God is by looking at the world around us and saying, this is my ultimate goal. What do I need to put up a wall to keep out? What am I separating myself from? But also, what am I going to include in this moment of designation? Am I going to, tefillah is a good example. I'm designating this time for closeness with God and for reflection. And for some people, that designation includes reading poetry or, singing Carlbach tunes or whatever it is, being musical. But there is a way to designate a certain space to reflect a greater purpose. And that is not something we're commanded in Kedoshim Tihiyu as a standalone mitzvah, or even as just a framework for what the other mitzvah is, but it's a mission statement for how we're supposed to continue to live our lives as moral people who strive to be close to God, but also as a nation who strives to reflect God's actions. So I wanted to open up the floor now and hear from people. First of all, what you think about my muktzah example. I don't know if anyone's ever learned Kedushah through muktzah before, but just kind of where, we've learned a lot of, different sources about keeping things in, running towards God. We learned some stuff about just it helping you be a good person. And now ultimately we're, I'm framing it as a mission statement to be close to God. So I'm wondering if anyone has any reflections or thoughts on that.
My one problem with the muktzah thing, is you apply it as everything has a time and place, and we're keeping it in the rest of the week and out on Shabbat. Whilst the separateness part, especially when you look at sexual conduct in the beginning, that is never in, that is always out.
Okay, I'm really happy you brought that up. I'm going to unshare my screen now so I can see everyone. Okay, I'm really happy you brought that up because I think you're right. And I think one of the things Kedushah does is give us a time and place for everything. So in the framework of intimacy, the things that are kind of prohibited sexually are things that we, I'm gonna borrow from Shmuley Boteach, but I'm gonna caveat by saying I don't love to borrow from Rabbi Shmuley Boteach. But I will say that one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard about intimacy in the framework of Judaism is that that there has to be a level of modesty to it. So I do think that like just because we're looking at something and saying that it's not right doesn't mean that if we do it within a certain time and place with a certain level of separateness or modesty to it, that there isn't a version of it that is okay. So the way we look at something and say, that's, we're completely keeping that out, especially around sexuality. It ties a little back kind of to the Yalta share that I gave, where Yalta's sitting talking to her husband and says, for everything that's prohibited in the Torah also permits us something that's similar. So while those sexual acts are prohibited because of the reasons they're prohibited, there are also ways through Kedushah which they are permitted.
Not incest, for instance.
No, not incest, not the big ones.
No, but there's an interesting. You one of the sources that you didn't bring. Hi, Ramie. Is the famous Ramban on this parasha, on this pasuk, where he specifically says we're talking about things that are permitted, not things that are forbidden. That you're allowed to have sexual intercourse with your wife, but don't become a sex addict. You're allowed to drink wine, but don't become a drunkard. And he uses this beautiful phrase, naval b'shut haTorah. You're like a bum, but in everything that the Torah allows. So in fact, he's laying on Kedushah as a restraint, as a qualifying tempera for your behavior on everything that's permitted, not everything that's forbidden. Okay. So he's adding a sort of spiritual component. Don't be a robot and say I'm abiding by the rules. I'm only sleeping with my wife, and I'm only drinking kosher wine, and I'm only eating kosher meat. He's saying in everything that you do, permittedly, behave in a way which is moderate and respectful. So I'm not sure that falls within the concept of separation, and it certainly doesn't fall within the ambit of things that are forbidden, because, as I say, he's talking about things that are specifically permitted there. But he says, don't just say I keep Taryag mitzvot. You can keep Taryag mitzvot without any of the spirit or any of the morality that should be underpinning it, and that's what he's saying Kedoshim to you means.
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you for that.
So would you mind? Could I just add in response to that? Certainly, also, I'd like to be the only non-family contributor so far to this to this class. That Alan, the piece that Ramie quoted from the Shara Yoshev of Shimon Shkop is actually a pshat in the Ramban that you're describing. He begins the essay with the Ramban. Yeah. And he goes on to explain that the notion of separation, or let's say abstemiousness with that which is permitted, is very hard to apply to God. And so he recast the whole idea of the Ramban in this very innovative way, which means Ramie didn't need to quote the Ramban because Reb Shimon Shkop is really a pshat in the Ramban. That's just a future reference.
Thanks.
The source I was expecting you to bring, first of all, I thought your whole presentation was, I was with you with your whole presentation, but the source I was expecting you to bring to back it up was of course, the expression mukudeshet. When we talk about betrothal, we talk about a person that is mukudash or mukudeshet.
Yeah. Yes,
it's not
exactly.
a direct analogy.
And so I think that, thinking of kiddushin with the same sex, obviously when you're makdish someone, when you marry them, or you're betrothed to them, you're setting them aside to be your partner. And I think all of the things that we were talking about, even what Barbara brought up about the level of Kedushah and intimacy that comes from that separateness, it all falls under Kiddushin. So you know, it's separate for now. You're my separate person, but also I think some of those things that we brought up before happen in like a Kodesh way now with that person. But certainly, I think Kiddushin is just to be honest, Kiddushin is like a hard thing to open up and move on from. But certainly, Kiddushin falls under like designating with an intention. Just in this case, it's a person, not like a mitzvah or an action or a time or a space. But the act of Kiddushin is kind of the ultimate designation of another partner, and hopefully it's the designation bringing someone in order to continue that mission of Kedushah. Like it's Kedushah in order to lead you to further being Makdish and Kedushah.
And then it's parallel to Hekdesh.
Yeah, definitely.
When time is ping pong?
Alan, were you just starting to say something, or you're just not muted?
Oh, sorry, I'm actually talking to myself. Apologies.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay, everyone's muted. So while everyone's muted, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Rabbi Belofsky for inviting me to teach. It's really been a wonderful process working with him towards me being able to teach in the shul. And I said this to him, but I do feel like I need to say publicly, I've really never worked with a rabbi and a partner in a community who has been so wonderful and respectful and open to talking things through with me. So I feel very grateful to have you as a partner in this community, and thank you for sharing your shul with me. And I just have nothing but respect for you and, appreciation for the work you do and allowing me to be a part of that.
Well, it's very kind. I mean, thank you very much. It's mostly our thanks is to you for sharing your ideas and for willing to talk and to be willing to engage in those conversations, which has led us to this point, which I'm really delighted about. I hope we'll invite you again. But on the condition that you don't have to spend too much time thanking me, I'm delighted to thank you. And I know that people have really enjoyed it, and I've remembered to record it, so hopefully we'll upload it later. And therefore, anyone who would like to watch it again, that will be possible. But also, there are people I think who would like to have joined, but we'll be able to see it afterwards. So, thank you very much to Ramie. Thank you for joining us, and look out for future classes. Just an advert: we have our next guest speaker is Diane Hall from the Federation of Synagogues, who you may remember was a star guest speaker in person. During a long time ago when people used to come to shul, and then there was a guest speaker, and then there was a kiddush afterwards, and in distant past we used to do things like that. Well, he was a guest speaker last winter, and it was a lot of fun. He's an expert in unusual financial cases, and he told some fascinating stories about Israeli builders and so on. And he's got some more of these stories, and he's going to look at some unusual cases from a halachic perspective. The first of two will be on Wednesday of next week. Details to follow through the shul list. And good night all.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.